Most people think the bulldog is barely paying attention. Just lying there. Half asleep. Heavy breathing from the corner of the room while life moves around them. But then something changes. An argument starts quietly in the kitchen. And before voices even rise, the bulldog lifts its head. Someone comes home hiding exhaustion behind a normal smile. And the dog follows them room to room without making a sound. A lonely night. A tense silence. A shift in energy so small most humans miss it entirely. The bulldog doesn't miss it. That's the unsettling part. Because beneath the slow movements and stubborn reputation is a dog constantly studying emotional patterns inside the home. Watching faces. Tracking tone changes. Memorizing routines people don't even realize they repeat. And the strange thing is, bulldogs often react before humans consciously understand what they're feeling themselves. Not with dramatic behavior. With proximity. With staring. Stillness. Silent monitoring. People call them lazy because they move slowly. Emotionally simple because they aren't hyperreactive. But that calm exterior hides something else entirely. Observation. Persistent observation. Over time, many bulldog owners begin noticing the same uncomfortable feeling. The dog seems emotionally attached in a way that feels almost human. And when emotional consistency inside the home suddenly disappears, the bulldog changes too. But to understand why bulldogs watch people this closely, you have to understand what kind of dog they were never supposed to become. The bulldog was never designed to be emotionally soft. In fact, the breed began inside one of the harshest human inventions imaginable. Bull baiting. For centuries, bulldogs were bred to grip enormous animals through chaos, noise, fear, and pain. They were selected for physical endurance, tolerance to stress, and the willingness to stay engaged in confrontation no matter what happened around them. A dog built for pressure. A dog built to absorb instability. And even now, you can still see fragments of that history frozen into their bodies. The heavy chest. The grounded stance. The jaw that looks permanently clenched against resistance itself. But then humanity changed the bulldog's purpose completely. The fighting arenas disappeared. The violence ended. And somehow, the same dog once engineered for conflict became one of the most emotionally human-dependent companion animals in modern homes. That transformation created a strange psychological contradiction. Because instincts rarely disappear cleanly. They evolve. Dogs bred around unstable, high-pressure environments often become hyper-attuned to emotional shifts. Not because they understand emotions the way humans do, but because survival historically depended on reading tension before it exploded. And the modern bulldog still carries traces of that vigilance. Only now there are no bulls to confront. No arena. No chaos to physically engage. So the sensitivity redirects itself somewhere else. Into the emotional climate of the household. That's why bulldogs often seem unusually affected by human conflict. A tense voice across the room. Sudden changes in routine. Emotional withdrawal from their owner. Even prolonged silence inside the home can alter their behavior in subtle ways. They start monitoring. Following. Watching. Waiting. Not out of dominance. Out of uncertainty. And visually, the contradiction becomes almost surreal. The bulldog looks intimidating. Dense. Unshakable. Like a dog emotionally armored against the world. But underneath that heavy exterior is often a nervous system deeply reactive to emotional inconsistency. A dog that craves predictability far more than people realize. Which is why the bulldog doesn't just enter a room physically. It reads the room first. And that contradiction changes the way a bulldog watches every room it enters. Most people think bulldogs are passive observers simply because they move slowly. But slow is not the same as unaware. In many homes, the bulldog becomes the first creature to notice when something emotionally shifts. Not after the explosion. Before it. A different set of footsteps coming down the hallway. A shorter answer at the dinner table. The silence after a stressful phone call. The strange emotional distance between two people sitting in the same room. Humans often ignore these signals consciously. Bulldogs don't. Because dogs don't experience a household the way humans do. They don't organize life around schedules, conversations, or explanations. They map environments emotionally. Patterns. Tension. Energy consistency. And bulldogs in particular become deeply attached to emotional predictability. That's why they often know exactly when someone is about to leave the house before shoes are even touched. Why they react differently to sadness than anger. Why some bulldogs suddenly refuse to leave an owner's side during periods of stress the humans themselves haven't fully acknowledged yet. The dog is not reading words. It's reading disruption. And bulldogs do this in a strangely unsettling way. Stillness. Other breeds react quickly and visibly. They pace, bark, whine, demand attention. Bulldogs often just watch, quietly, from doorways, cross rooms, beside the bed at night. Their low-energy demeanor disguises something psychologically intense, constant environmental monitoring. You can see it during arguments. Not every bulldog panics outwardly. Some simply appear nearby and stay there. As if the dog feels compelled to supervise emotional instability until the atmosphere settles again. And crying creates a completely different reaction. Anger often makes bulldogs cautious. Sadness pulls them closer. Owners describe the same patterns over and over again without realizing how revealing they are. The bulldog that suddenly leans against someone after emotional collapse. The dog that refuses to eat during prolonged household tension. The silent following behavior that starts after major life changes. At first, it feels comforting. Then it starts feeling eerie. Because eventually, many owners notice something difficult to explain. The bulldog seems emotionally affected by problems nobody directly taught it to understand. And when the emotional environment becomes unpredictable for too long, the dog itself begins changing. More withdrawal. More clinginess. More stubborn resistance. But the terrifying part is, most owners mistake that anxiety for stubbornness. The bulldog has spent decades being misunderstood by the very people who love it most. Stubborn. Lazy. Difficult. Those labels follow the breed everywhere. The bulldog refuses a command? Stubborn. Stops walking mid-route? Lazy. Ignores people during stressful moments? Difficult. But what if a large part of that behavior isn't defiance at all? What if it's emotional overload? Because bulldogs often respond to stress differently than people expect. Many high-energy dogs react outwardly when overwhelmed. They bark louder, move faster, become destructive. Bulldogs frequently do the opposite. They shut down, freeze, withdraw, resist movement entirely. And to humans, that stillness looks intentional, almost manipulative, like the dog is choosing not to cooperate. But psychologically, freezing is also a conflict response. A nervous system trying to stabilize itself when the environment feels emotionally unpredictable. Which explains why some bulldogs become dramatically more stubborn during periods of household tension. Divorce, grief, burnout, emotional inconsistency. Even subtle changes in a person's emotional availability can alter the dog's behavior over time. The bulldog absorbs instability slowly, then expresses it slowly. And because the signs are quiet, owners often miss the connection completely. That creates a painful cycle. The human becomes frustrated. The bulldog senses the frustration. Emotional safety decreases. The dog withdraws further. Now the bulldog appears even more stubborn. So the owner pushes harder. More commands. More irritation. Less patience. Meanwhile, the dog is not becoming dominant. It's becoming emotionally uncertain. And the tragedy is that bulldogs are unusually sensitive to the emotional tone behind human behavior. They may not understand the exact reason someone is upset, but they absolutely detect the shift in energy surrounding them, especially from the people they trust most. Which is why bulldogs often form their deepest attachments with humans carrying emotional exhaustion themselves. People who move through life quietly stressed, quietly lonely, quietly overwhelmed. Somehow the bulldog finds them. And strangely, the people bulldogs attach to most are often carrying emotional exhaustion themselves. There's a reason bulldogs often choose one person in the house and emotionally orbit them with almost unsettling intensity. And strangely, that person is very often the one struggling the most. Not the loudest person. Not the most energetic. Not even the one giving the most commands. The emotionally exhausted one. The person who sits in silence longer than everyone else. The one carrying grief quietly through ordinary routines. The one masking stress well enough that other humans barely notice it. The bulldog notices. Again and again, owners describe the same pattern without realizing how specific it is. The bulldog that suddenly becomes inseparable after a breakup. The dog that sleeps outside the bathroom door during depressive episodes. The one that refuses to leave someone alone after loss, illness, burnout, or emotional collapse. As if the dog senses fragility before the world does. And in many ways, it probably does. Because dogs are biologically wired for emotional synchronization. Over time, they begin regulating themselves around human emotional patterns. Heart rates, routines, stress signals, tone shifts, movement changes, all of it becomes part of the dog's psychological environment. But bulldogs take this attachment style into unusually intimate territory. Many breeds seek stimulation first. Activity, exploration, excitement. Bulldogs often seek emotional proximity instead. They don't always need movement. They need presence. That's why a bulldog can spend hours doing almost nothing except remaining physically near someone emotionally distressed. Leaning against a leg. Sleeping beside a bed. Following silently from room to room with this strange, unwavering seriousness. And the longer the human struggles emotionally, the deeper the attachment can become. First, it feels beautiful. Healing even. The person feels understood without speaking. The bulldog becomes a source of grounding during panic, loneliness, or emotional instability. A constant emotional witness inside a world that suddenly feels unpredictable. But something else is happening at the same time. The bulldog is reorganizing its own emotional stability around that person's condition. That's the part most people never see. The dog begins depending on emotional closeness not just for affection, but for regulation itself. The human's mood becomes psychologically important to the bulldog's sense of safety, which means emotional distress inside the owner no longer stays contained inside the owner. The dog absorbs it too. And bulldogs often absorb it quietly. No dramatic warning signs. No obvious behavioral explosions. Just increasing attachment. Increasing monitoring. Increasing anxiety whenever emotional distance appears. Until eventually, some bulldogs stop functioning like independent dogs emotionally at all. They become watchers. Emotional anchors. Silent supervisors of human pain. And that's where the relationship quietly becomes something much heavier than companionship. Some bulldogs don't just bond with their owners emotionally. They build their entire sense of stability around them. And when that emotional anchor suddenly disappears, even temporarily, the effects can become surprisingly intense. People expect separation anxiety to look dramatic. Destroying furniture. Constant barking. Chaotic behavior. But bulldogs often express distress differently. Quieter. Which makes it harder to recognize until the emotional dependency has already deepened. A bulldog may begin pacing slowly through empty rooms after someone leaves. Not frantically. Almost methodically. As if searching for emotional confirmation the environment no longer provides. Others become obsessive shadows before separation even happens. Following their person into every room. Waiting outside doors. Refusing to settle unless physical proximity is restored. And some bulldogs do something even more concerning. They shut down. Less engagement. Longer sleeping periods. Reduced appetite. A strange emotional flatness owners mistake for calmness. But internally, the nervous system may be under enormous stress. Because emotionally observant dogs struggle when predictability disappears. Especially breeds that organize safety around stable emotional routines. And bulldogs are deeply routine-oriented emotionally. They notice when someone stops laughing as much. When tension lingers in conversations. When grief changes the rhythm of a household. When emotional availability quietly disappears over weeks or months. Even if nobody says it out loud. The bulldog still feels the atmosphere changing. And unlike more reactive breeds that discharge stress physically through movement, bulldogs often internalize emotional strain directly into their bodies. Their breathing changes. Sleep becomes restless. Clinginess intensifies. Some become hypervigilant to departures. Others stop emotionally relaxing altogether, constantly monitoring the home for signs of instability. Which creates one of the breed's strangest paradoxes. The calmer the bulldog appears externally, the more stress it may actually be carrying internally. Because bulldogs are masters of emotional compression. They don't always explode under pressure. They absorb it. Silently. That's why owners sometimes realize too late that the dog wasn't being lazy during emotionally difficult periods. The bulldog was psychologically dysregulated the entire time. Not searching for entertainment. Searching for reassurance. For emotional confirmation that the bond still exists. That the environment is still safe. That the person it emotionally organized itself around is still emotionally present. And once you see that pattern clearly, many ordinary bulldog behaviors suddenly become heartbreaking. The staring. The following. The waiting near doors. The refusal to fully relax when tension exists inside the home. Because the most heartbreaking part isn't how bulldogs react to attention. It's how they react to emotional absence. There's a moment many bulldogs experience that owners never notice. Not because they don't care. Because life slowly pulls their attention somewhere else. Stress. Bills. Exhaustion. Burnout that quietly flattens a person emotionally until they begin moving through their own home like a ghost of themselves. And to humans, those changes feel internal. Private. But to a bulldog, the emotional shift becomes part of the environment immediately. The eye contact shortens. The voice loses warmth. Affection becomes rushed and mechanical. Small rituals disappear without anyone consciously deciding to remove them. The bulldog notices every one of them. Not intellectually. Emotionally. That's what makes this so painful. Bulldogs cannot understand human explanations. They don't understand financial pressure, depression, emotional burnout, grief, or the invisible weight adults carry silently for years. They only understand presence. And eventually, absence. Not physical absence. Emotional absence. The owner is still there. Still feeding them. Still walking through the same rooms. But something in the emotional connection has gone quiet. And many bulldogs respond to that silence in ways so subtle they're almost invisible unless you know what you're looking at. The dog waiting outside closed doors longer than usual. The silent staring from across the room. Sleeping beside someone who no longer reaches down absent-mindedly to touch them. Watching. Waiting. As if trying to figure out when the emotional distance began. And the heartbreaking part is that bulldogs rarely stop loving people simply because emotional reciprocity fades. They stay close anyway. Still following. Still monitoring. Still emotionally available long after the human has emotionally withdrawn into stress, distraction, or survival mode. Almost like the bulldog remembers the emotional version of the person that existed before the exhaustion took over. And maybe that loyalty is why this breed affects people so deeply. The bulldog's real need was never attention. Not in the way people usually think. It wasn't endless stimulation. Not constant entertainment. Not even physical affection by itself. What bulldogs crave most is emotional certainty. Consistency. Predictable warmth. The quiet reassurance that the emotional bond around them is still intact. And suddenly, so many of their behaviors start looking completely different. The staring no longer feels empty. The following no longer feels clingy. The silent observation from across the room no longer feels passive. It's emotional calibration. The bulldog constantly checking. Is everything still safe? Is this person still emotionally here with me? Has the atmosphere changed again? That's why bulldog owners often describe a feeling that's strangely difficult to explain to people who've never lived with one. The feeling of being understood without speaking. Because bulldogs don't just respond to visible behavior. They respond to emotional presence itself. They notice the heaviness in a room before conversations happen. They recognize emotional withdrawal before humans consciously admit it to themselves. And over time, many people slowly realize something almost backwards about the relationship. They thought they rescued the bulldog. But during loneliness, grief, exhaustion, emotional collapse, the bulldog was carrying them too. Quietly. With proximity. With patience. With that strange, unwavering watchfulness that once seemed lazy or emotionally simple from the outside. And once you see it, you can never unsee the way a bulldog looks at you. Maybe your bulldog was never asking for attention at all. Maybe all those quiet moments, the staring, the following, the silent waiting beside doors, were never random behaviors. Maybe your bulldog was studying the emotional world around it to feel safe inside it. Even now, somewhere tonight, a bulldog is lying awake in the dark watching the person it loves breathe. Not because it wants something. Because emotional closeness became its way of understanding stability itself. And once you realize that, the breed stops feeling stubborn. Stops feeling emotionally simple. It starts feeling deeply aware. So now I'm curious. What strange emotional behaviors has your bulldog noticed about you before anyone else did? Share your story in the comments. And if you want more deep psychological documentaries about the hidden emotional lives of dog breeds, subscribe for the next one. Some dogs hear your voice. Bulldogs learn your emotional rhythm.